Hi, I'm Katie Freeman. I am the host of the Maker Mom podcast, which is a podcast that has 2 weekly episodes. You're watching/listening to the Wednesday episode, which is the Wonder Woman episode, focuses on female and non-binary makers of all kinds. And then Friday episodes is focused on interviewing other moms who are makers. All right, so this week's Wonder Woman episode is with Emma Hardy. She is a lyrist, which means and I think I'm saying that right, which means she makes violins, and she is located over in London currently. And so we had a fantastic talk about, the history of violin making and learning that craft, her journey into starting to make violins and where she kind of came from, her background. And so I think you're going to absolutely love this interview with her. But before we jump into that, I want to give a big shout out and thank you to the patrons over on Patreon. So thank you so much, Laura of the Oakley Soap Company, Mary Lou, Made by Mary Lou, Amy, Bison Valley Carving, Dan and Kelly, sorry I have my cheat list over here, Dan and Kelly of Reclaim Living Store, Brandy, Studio Obey, Kathy, One Girl and Her Tools, Ellen, Little Bear Furniture, and Ethan Carter Designs. Make sure you hang out to the end of the episode to find out more about the podcast itself and how you can continue to support the podcast if you are loving it. All right, with no further ado, here is Emma. Well, Emma, I always have my guest give an introduction about themselves. So if you don't mind, we can start there.
Sure. So my name is Emma Hardy, and I am a violin maker, sort of in training. I've just finished my 3rd year of studying. So I'm kind of making that transition now into not being a student anymore. But COVID did put a little bit of a spanner in the works with that. So I'm probably going to go back for another year, but just a day a week to just sort of brush up on a couple of things that I've missed out on since March. Since kind of January, I've had my own workspace and been starting to make that kind of transition. And I live in London. Been here about 7 years. That's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Okay, awesome. Well, did you grow up in London?
No. Okay. No. So I moved around a bit, but I started off in the south of England, down. I guess the nearest place that you might have heard of is Brighton.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of one of the seaside towns near Brighton. And then when I was about 10 years old, my parents bought a completely derelict house in the middle of nowhere and moved us all, and we lived in a caravan next to it while they spent, they kind of had it, they did it room by room. So we were ostensibly moved in after about 5 years. But the bathroom didn't really get finished until I was at university. Because my parents both worked full time and they were sort of just doing it around that. So that was a bit of an adventure. I think where I got some of my handiness, because I would help with like putting down floors and putting up sheds and things.
I was going to say it totally makes sense when you mentioned that you would get into some sort of making.
Yeah.
How many siblings do you have?
I just have the one brother who has just finished a master's, and he's going to be moving in with me actually, coming down to London. He's been in Manchester, but job market pretty bad at the moment, so he's gonna come crash with me and my husband for a bit while he's figuring it all out. So that'll be nice to have him around. We're quite close, so that'll be nice.
Very nice. All right, so sounds like you got at least an introduction to making. as a child. Did you play the violin as a kid?
I did, yeah. I started playing when I was around 7 or 8, but then when we moved, I then didn't get a new teacher sort of until I was about 13. And then I gave it up when I was 16. So I was not a very dedicated player as a child. But I took it up again just before I started violin making. And I'm still having lessons every week, and I still play. And normally would be playing in an orchestra, obviously hold at the moment. So yeah, it's not a complete, you don't have to play the violin in order to make them, but obviously it helps. And I think it sort of comforts the players that you're selling to if they know that you play yourself. Yeah.
I no violin, but I played the viola from
cool.
grade 4 all the way through grade 12. However, I seldom ever practiced, and so I was not fantastic by any means, and I definitely haven't played since high school.
I'd love to pick up the viola sometime, but I'm trying to make myself get better at violin first before I switch over, because I think with musical instruments it's so easy to just get to a certain point and then start switching between them, because the fun bit is that initial couple of years where you're getting to grips with it, but then making the transition from like beginner to advanced takes that like really tough hard work. So that's that's the bit I'm in at the moment, and it's really easy to just go, well, maybe I should pick up the viola, and that would be fun. But yeah, I think maybe in the next couple of years I'll make myself a viola. And
there you go. I mean, I was never a fan of the violin just because of the pitch.
Yeah, it is tough.
So I enjoyed the viola because it is a little bit more, but I really wanted to play cello. That's what I really wanted to play, was cello.
It's never too late.
I know. But it is a lot harder now with like kids and all of that stuff. I
can totally understand. Maybe it could be a retirement project.
There you go. Probably retirement. I have found, I thought after high school I really did, because I never enjoyed practicing. I think kind of what you're getting at too, of like, I don't find the fun in perfecting, craft.
They're like playing the same scale 50 times over for an hour. I can understand that.
And so I thought, well, maybe I'm just not really into music, but we started our oldest, my son, into piano lessons, and my wife has never played a musical instrument, and so she's like, you have to help him, because you can actually like read music, and and that and I've never played a piano ever.
Yeah,
but I found
claps,
it. Right? Yeah, they're
different. Yeah.
Totally different clefs from a viola. But I have found kind of that spark of like, it's fun because I kind of get to learn with him through helping him. And so it's like, oh, this isn't as hard as I thought it, necessarily would be, type thing.
Yeah, I think it's really daunting, isn't it, when you go from not having any exposure to it. But that's really cool that your son is having a go at it.
He wants to. I mean, the way we talked him into piano was learn to read music, play piano, so you can get to guitar. That's really what he wants to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. There's children's instruments is definitely an area. I'm actually working on a half-size violin at the moment, so it's a children's violin. It's kind of where I would like to go into is producing children's instruments, because there are some amazing makers producing instruments for children, but it's definitely not the priority of lots of makers. And I think that there's just such a need for really good quality instruments for children that they can rent rather than buying, because obviously buying an instrument made by a violin maker outright is not that you would want to when your kid's growing out of it every 6 months.
And I mean, exactly. Like, I mean, I never owned my own viola. We rented all the way through.
And I think, that's, I worked in a music shop for a while, and it always seemed to kind of surprise parents when you told them you can just rent a violin. You don't have to buy an awful £80 one off Amazon that is just going to be terrible and your kid is never going to play it and it's just going to be really traumatic for everybody involved. You can just rent something that's actually quite good, and it's not going to cost, and there are loads of charities out there as well that do also help with people who are from backgrounds where the cost of renting a violin is a lot too. So I kind of what I'm interested in is broadening the knowledge about that, and that there is so much that the parents can access, and to try and make it seem less daunting, because it is daunting.
Now in England, so like in the States, we have almost every school has at least band. Not every school has orchestra, but the ones that do usually start around grade 4 or 5 to start through the school system. So, but in England, is it done through school systems, or is it all on your own if you're going to play an instrument?
This is a big source of contention at the moment in the UK, because historically the music education has been fairly good, but we've had massive amounts of cuts over the last 10 years to all of the arts, music and art and woodworking and all of those things have just been completely not completely gone, but really, really reduced. So a lot of it has fallen to parents to pay for privately, which, just doesn't really make sense to me. Because like you say, having an orchestra, and orchestras, they're normally, it's like, well, you would do it in a lunchtime, and it's definitely not a priority in a lot of schools. There are, there are music teachers out there who tried the absolute best that they can within the limited budgets that they're given and the time and the schedule. But quite often in schools now, in a secondary school, which could have 1,000 children in it, there'll be like one music teacher. So it's just it's not realistic to expect that all of the students are going to have great access to music in that situation. But primary schools are some primary schools allocate their budget in a way that means that every kid learns, I think it's like piano, cello or violin for a year, and they'll have like maybe lessons in pairs or something like that for half an hour a week. So it just varies massively depending on the area and the funding of the school. It's something I think that lots of people are trying to campaign about and improve.
I think, I do think that is similar to here, in the sense of cuts continue to happen to the arts in the education system, and it gets harder and harder for
it just makes no sense, because the arts industries are massive and music industry is massive, and there's sort of the attitude that it's the academic subjects that are the ones that are going to get you a job. It doesn't make any sense to me.
And it's crazy too, because especially starting our oldest out in piano, his and we pay for private lessons for him, but his piano instructor said like he is really good at like math is like the thing he excels at, and she's like, math and music go hand in hand, and so like he'll excel even more now at math. And,
absolutely. I hear that a lot, that lots of people who are good at maths are also really good at music. And it would be, if somebody is pursuing maths, my husband studied maths, and knowing how incredibly hard he works, I think it's nice for people who are really academic to have even an outlet through music, even if it's then not going to be their career. I think we massively undervalue the creative sort of output that people can have just even as a hobby.
Exactly. So besides your experience of basically renovating your house,
my parents are going to listen to this. They're going to listen to this and be like, you have massively overplayed how much you helped.
Well, even getting that exposure, right, to that going on. Did you do any other woodworking before making violins?
No, not really. No, we had we call it DT Wood in school, which I think is the equivalent of wood shop for you guys. That I think I had like an hour a week for one term in secondary school, and I think I made the world's worst puzzle. I don't know, it was something terrible. It didn't fit together. So I didn't think woodworking honestly was not on my radar until I started studying violin making. So before doing this, I was working as a book cover designer, and my degree was in animation, which had quite a lot of crafting because you make the puppets and things like that. So I did know that I could do stuff with my hands, and was good at making things. And woodworking had appealed to me, but I just never had an opportunity to do anything with it. And so I was working as a freelance book cover designer, knowing that I kind of wanted to find something else because it was much more computer based than I thought it was going to be. And was driving me a bit insane. And I enrolled on a hobby course in Cambridge that I just went to on weekends for a little while in violin making. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I just love it. And so then enrolled on the formal course in London, which I've been doing for the last 3 years. And it's definitely the right decision. I just love it so much. It's great.
But it sounds like, I mean, with, like you said, you majored in animation, so a drive to creativity as a path of career, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in another world, I would have been very happy as like a puppet maker or something. But during my degree, I just sort of got a bit sidetracked. Everything was about computer animation was becoming a really big thing. And so our tutors were kind of pushing us towards that because there were more jobs in all of that. And I didn't really stop to think about what it was that I enjoyed about the animating. And it was definitely the like 3D stuff, and I just didn't really realize that until I had sort of gone down the wrong path.
Well, I mean, that's kind of hard to realize that stuff in your early 20s,
right?
late teens.
Yeah, I don't think I really figured it out even until I was working as a graphic designer, and I was like, oh wait, it's the being at the computer that is the thing that is not fun here. So I guess. But my family are all very kind of creative. So obviously my parents did all the stuff at the house, but my mum also, she originally studied fashion and textiles and made all of her own clothes. And my grandmother's on both sides actually. My grandma on my dad's side does a huge amount of ceramics. And then my grandmother on my mother's side was an amazing embroiderer. And kind of maker of all sorts of things. My aunt does stained glass work. There are a lot of makers in the family. So I think that also kind of meant that I was exposed to lots of people making things, and so it didn't sound too crazy to them when I was like, I think I'm going to quit my steady job as a book cover designer and learn this ancient craft that nobody's ever heard of.
To get to that, like, did you feel like you were crazy when you made that decision?
A bit. I was, it felt like I still occasionally I'm like, oh my God, was this the right thing to do in terms of my finances? But but I mean, I'm just starting out, so it is scary, and it would be scary no matter what I was doing when you're at this point, when you're making that first leap into the professional realm. So I'm not, I was scared, but not in like a I shouldn't do it way, just in a like, this is kind of exciting and a bit scary.
Now, I am going to fully admit I know nothing about making a violin or any musical instrument.
I think 99% of the population would be with you there.
Besides, like, I mean, I've watched content around making them because I do think there's something beautiful about it. I don't know necessarily violin, but definitely making of like an acoustic guitar has me intrigued. Stuff like that is something that I want to do at some point in time in my
Cool.
life for sure. But I want to know, I guess, on the career side, it's my understanding, I mean, like, you are your own artist. Like, this will be your, like, you're not working for, is that correct?
Yeah,
Or is that out there? I don't know, I guess. Like,
the vast majority of violin makers work for themselves. There's a sort of so everybody who trains as a violin maker will also get will likely get a bit of training in violin repair work, and repair work is often the sort of bread and butter of most makers, but not all of them. And so some people, if they are not suited to working on their own, will go and work in a repair shop, or if they just want the extra training that comes with going and working in a repair shop, because obviously then you're surrounded by people who've been doing it for like 20 years. So violin making is definitely one of those things that you never really stop learning. And so if you can position yourself in a shop, then you'll get vast amounts of knowledge from doing that. But that's not for everyone, and I don't think I'm going to go and do that, because I don't enjoy the repair stuff as much, at least what I've done of it. But that's sort of what I'm going to be going back to college a day a week to do, is to just brush up on my repair work, because I haven't done so much of that. My intention is to strike out on my own, and I really like working on my own. It suits me quite well. I like the flexibility that comes with it, and just having your own space, and I think that it definitely suits me. I'm not sure if it would have suited me when I first, when you're like 18, I imagine it would be very difficult to go straight into it. But having worked in offices, learned how to have a schedule, and how to work to deadlines, and how to communicate with customers and all of that stuff. I do feel like I have that experience that maybe the younger violin makers who go into repair workshops, that's what they're learning there as well. I kind of feel like I already have that, and so then really what I just need to do is get good at making. The intention is to just work for myself, and that's most people who just focus on making work for themselves.
Okay. So does that mean, do you generally have a customer before you make, or do you make and then basically look for customers to buy what you made?
The dream in the end is to have a very long waiting list of people who just cannot wait to get their hands on one of your instruments, and that you've got work for the next 3 years, which the more established makers tend to have. But when you're starting out, you make them and then you try and get someone to buy them. That's why I'm also particularly interested in producing children's instruments to rent them, because I can kind of make them at my own pace and rent them out. And while it'll take a couple of years for the money to recoup for that, once it is set up, hopefully then I have quite a nice passive income that I can then concentrate on maybe making much more detailed. So there's kind of different levels of violin making. You can make a violin quite quickly, or you can spend a year on one, and obviously there'll be differences in quality and the craftsmanship that goes with those. And there are competitions that happen all over the world that people enter, and the level of work that goes into those instruments for competitions is just astonishing. So ideally one day, if I have some passive income set up, I could spend my time making the really, really good quality stuff. But I'm just going to kind of see how it goes and figure out as I go along.
So the dream is that one day there is the Emma J. Hardy violin that everybody wants to have, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that your dream legacy then too? Like, once you're gone, like, everyone will be like, oh my God, it's an Emma J. Hardy violin.
That would be very nice. But I think also just producing instruments that function for the duration that the musician need them to, and are long lasting. But it's one of the things I definitely really love about violins is that they last hundreds of years if they're looked after properly and made properly. So yeah, that is a nice prospect to think that the things I'm making will hopefully outlive me. And every time I kind of come across an old instrument with a maker's name in it, and you know that it was hundreds of years ago, it is really amazing. Like I've got a child's violin that I bought in an auction recently hanging up here that's from 1820. Wow. And I just think, like, what else in my house do I have that's from 1820? So I love that it's like something that lots of people can have access to, that's like old and a bit special. That it kind of gets this second lease of life later. It starts off as a nice new instrument that someone has commissioned or bought that is really special to them, and then as it's passed down through the generations, it gains history, and it just keeps kind of growing. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to ask you probably a question that really will show I know nothing. What type of wood are violins made from?
This is like the number one question I get asked at parties.
I'm sure. That would be me not knowing anything about it.
No, so the back, the sides, and the neck are made from maple. Sorry, God, made from maple. Maple. Okay. And then the front is spruce. And so the idea is that the maple forms like it's more solid, so it's less vibrates less. And then so it's kind of like if you imagine a drum, you have the hard sides and then the calf skin on the top. The spruce is kind of acting as the calf skin, is my understanding. And then the bridge, which is the bit that holds the strings up in the middle, that's also maple. The fingerboards are normally ebony, and then the fittings are often ebony as well, but they vary a little bit. So yeah, there's all sorts of maple. If you kind of look at lots of violins, you'll see that no one violin looks the same on the back of them, because you can get different types of flames, and there's like bird's eye maple, and which you probably come across in.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's actually quite a few species of maple as well.
Right.
Like there's sugar maple, which is not as hard as like a silver maple. So there's varying types of maple wood, and then they tend to have different, to your point, like different effects. Like bird's eye maple, which really is not a species of maple. It's just the effect that moisture and all of that had on the wood. But it's that won't necessarily happen to every species of maple. You know what I mean? Because there's different densities and all that. But that I didn't know that, because they're all stained as well. Like I would never have guessed that it was maple.
So I sometimes get people commenting, like friends and stuff, that are like, why are you making a white violin? And I'm just like, oh, that's just the color before they're stained. I don't know why we stain them. That was something I've been trying to find out. So if anyone is listening and has a better understanding of violin making history than me, I'd love to know where that started. And because I think lots of Baroque violins were not stained, or precursors to the violin were not. So I don't know why it started.
All right, so today's podcast episode is sponsored by Bad Workwear North America. They are an Australian-based workwear brand that launched in the US and Canada last fall. Now, I haven't tried their gear yet myself, but have heard great things about their gear from our friends in the maker community, especially women who are excited to find workwear that looks great and fits right. They carry a women's line of items, but based on the slim fit of all their clothing, all their line is considered unisex, as women have great success just sizing down in the men's items and getting a great fit. If you want to check them out, visit www.badnorthamerica.com and use the code MakerMom10 at checkout to get 10% off your order. All right, let's head back into the episode.
But yeah.
So that means you could totally shake up the industry and start making like teal violins, right? Like you could totally.
Yeah, the violin making industry, I think, is possibly the most conservative industry that has ever existed. I don't think, that's been interesting as well, to try and sort of discover the boundaries of the industry and try and figure out which boundaries you might want to try and break and which ones you definitely don't want to cross.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that was going to be my next question. So like you're describing all the components of the violin and what types of wood they're made from. I'm assuming over time, because people have been making violins for hundreds of years, that they've tried out different species of wood to see what works best. But then even to that, like, is somebody in Canada who's making violins using those same species as you are in the UK? Like, is it across the industry?
Yeah, so you're right that people have experimented. I think pear gets used sometimes. We also, so the inside of the violin, there are a few things that sort of keep the structure together, that traditionally is spruce, but sometimes people use willow. So definitely on the inside of the violin, people are more likely to vary the wood that they're using. But yeah, none of it's just spruce and maple, basically everywhere. Some makers do produce stuff. I think violins that are for the folk music players are slightly more likely to be made from different woods. I've heard, but I don't know very much about that. And I think it's just tradition. Although I guess with maple, it does have unusual qualities in its hardness, but it's not super heavy, and so I think that probably helps. It also just looks really nice.
I guess in my head as a woodworker, I'm going, walnut to me would be just as sturdy as like a maple.
Yeah,
and to me the same weight. Like if I was to get it down to the thinness of a violin.
But I wonder if the density would vary. This is the thing, is I've just worked with maple and spruce, so I don't really know so much about the other woods. I've been really interested I want to try and make a child's violin using ash for the back, because I looked up the densities and they're fairly similar, but it's more flexible, because traditionally they were used to make wheels out of, because they're so springy, so you can like throw them at the ground and they'll bounce without snapping. And so my theory is, if you make a child's violin out of that, when they drop it, it won't crack. But I haven't tried it yet, so I don't know how it would sound. And also, I don't know if with a child's violin, which isn't going to sound as nice as a full-sized anyway, because it doesn't have the air volume, maybe you could be a bit more experimental with so that is definitely an area I want to get into. But to answer your question, basically all violin makers will mostly just use those. But everybody has different tone wood suppliers, so there will be variations in this kind of the species, how it's grown. Violin makers prefer wood that's grown very high up and very slowly, generally.
So old growth, is that usually what they're going for?
You kind of want it to I guess, because it's like much more dense. And so but even within that, some violin makers will vary in what they prefer to have. So that's what it'll vary within the maple and spruce. And I have noticed actually at the last couple of events I've been at with lots of violin makers, lots of people are starting to talk about using much more plain wood for the backs than has traditionally been used. I haven't quite figured out whether that's just a fashion within violin makers, but I had like 5 people separately go, I like plain wood. I think I'm going to use more plain wood now. So I think that maybe that's something that more violin makers are experimenting with. I haven't figured out why yet.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, you were talking about like what will the kind of the market take. But I mean, when's the last time there was a revolution within like the design of, the violin?
Like 200, 300 years ago. I
Yeah,
don't know.
exactly.
Stradivari was, I think, probably the last one you could point to, because he experimented with. So before Stradivari, the next most famous maker was Amati, and Stradivari really like shook things up a bit. But I mean, even then, if I showed you the two violins, you would probably go, they look the same.
It's in the sound, right? I mean, that's where the changes are.
Although, having said that, actually, when we moved from the Baroque period to the more classical periods, the neck was reset and changed slightly. So very, very old violins have a slightly shorter neck with, I gotta get this right, I think a higher projection, but I'm not totally good on my Baroque setup. And then also the fingerboards were often made of maple back then as well. So a Baroque violin does look fairly different from a modern violin within reason. Still looks like a violin. But
right.
I think the biggest sort of changes are more around how we make them. So there's quite a lot happening now with people experimenting with like CNC machining that does like the initial roughing for you. I haven't done any of that, but and I know that like when they're being mass produced in like China, they have machines that can do the scrolls. So there's like developments coming in how we're making them, and I think particularly in repair work, that's quite exciting, because you can do stuff like if you have a crack or like a break in a violin, you can do a 3D scan of the break and then get a computer to cut out a piece of wood that perfectly fits it, which you know is then doing a job better than a traditional craftsperson. Whereas with the making stuff, like you can't at the moment automate what a violin maker can do better on a computer. So like I think people are worrying a bit about the machines coming that way, but I think really what they'll just do is aid, in the same way as power tools. Lots of people use power tools in their making, and it's not going to replace us. It'll just be a tool that we learn to use.
Exactly. I had another a maker on here that I would say was a fine woodworker, Laura Mays, and we talked about the difference, between hand tools and power tools. And you definitely have hand tool purists, like they're not going to use a power tool ever. And she said, it took her time, but she eventually basically came to the realization of like, is there a difference between me using a handsaw and like a circular saw if I'm getting the same cut in a quarter of the time? No, there's not. So just understanding where it is more beneficial for the piece to use something that has more of that finesse. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in violin making, it's exactly the same. You have people who are complete purists about never using power tools. And I think if that, for me, part of the joy of being a violin maker is the making. So if you don't enjoy using power tools, then fine, don't use them. And I don't really use them, but that's been because I'm absolutely terrified of them. But I did recently just buy myself a belt sander, which was a big step for me. And I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. It just saves me so much time, and like you say, you get the same result. So I think as well, particularly if you've already learned how to do it by hand, there is no harm in using power tools to help you if you're getting the same result. I would maybe in violin making push people to learn how to do it by hand first, just because you like have a better understanding of what you're doing in some contexts, but not all.
I think it's similar, especially if you aspire to be what I would call a fine woodworker, right? It is much more of a piece of furniture from a fine woodworker is definitely probably 60% about the actual craft of making that piece, and 40% about the design. In my mind, you're purchasing that and enjoying the understanding of the craftsmanship that went into it. So I would say in that realm, it's the same, like being able to do it all by hand. That's my co-host. Yes. There's another one around here somewhere.
Love it.
Yes. Two kitten co-hosts.
Ideal.
Yes. But it was the same when I did do some woodworking schooling. The professor I had there, we didn't have to perfect doing it by hand, but we did learn how to do everything by hand before we went to the power tool. So
yeah, I think it's a good way, because it also just gives you a bit of like time to adjust to what you're doing anyway. And I think I'm not super against power tools if people enjoy using them.
I think you learn more about things like wood movement and stuff when you do it all by hand.
Yeah, like the
hand
grain
tools first. Yeah.
And that is a massive part with violin making. It's all about like understanding the piece of wood you're working with and the grain direction. And so I think that definitely is important. But yeah, maybe one day I'll build up to getting a bandsaw. But at college, my workbench is right next to the bandsaw, and honestly, it makes me feel sick when people use it. I have to move away. I hate it so much. I just can't. I can't believe that anybody isn't going to chop their hand off. So I'm pretty awful with that.
Maybe I can make you feel a little bit better. It's not totally impossible to hurt yourself on a bandsaw. I will say that, not totally impossible, but it's very rare that somebody actually hurts themselves.
I mean, it's like in 3 years, and I've seen some people who not like totally convinced that they're the safest people on it, and they still haven't managed to hurt themselves. And we get like safety training, and our tutor does like what we call a driving test, where you're not allowed to use it until he can observe you using it safely on your own. So I've done all of that. I can use them. It just makes me like feel ill, so I just don't do it.
I get it. I have I still my router, my big router. It's one of those, like, it's a last resort. I'm on a tight deadline. I have to use it. But
it's something I do want to like get over that, because also I would eventually like to have a go at making some furniture and that kind of thing, and I just think there's like no getting around, if you've got massive sheets of stuff. I would definitely want to use power tools. So the belt sander is a start.
So, okay, you just brought up, maybe eventually getting into like furniture or something like that. So do you think making violins is more about the love of violin making, or more about the love of making something with your hands?
I think it's a bit of both. I really like furniture is functional. So I would say that with violins, there's something really magical about a musician taking it out of your hand and playing with it, which, I'm sure when people are using your like as a dining room table that a family takes, I can imagine there's like a similar feeling. So I think I would also enjoy being a furniture maker. But I also really love all of the history that goes with the violin making, all of the, it just feels like there's a never-ending pile of stuff to learn about. So that's why, I think one day I would also like to move into furniture stuff. But you have the two sides of the violin making, which is the making and then the musicians. So that does really appeal to me. So I think, the furniture making stuff would be, I think, more of on a hobby basis. But I have no idea how to do joints and stuff, because like you don't do them in violins, or like you have the neck joint, but that's not like, I don't think it's like any joint you would do in furniture making. So I would maybe do an evening course or something in furniture making one day, but it would just be furniture for myself, I think. That feels like a whole other. It would feel like a career change, I think. It's like such a big difference.
Oh, I'm sure.
But I think furniture making does look. I think particularly chair making appeals to me. I'm not sure why. But yeah,
probably because it's one of the most difficult things to make.
Is it? Oh no. That sounds about right. But, I think chairs Like every time I go past furniture shops, like antique furniture shops and stuff, I'm always just like, oh God, look at all those chairs. I would fill my house with chairs if it wouldn't bankrupt me. Yeah.
So, it definitely feels like over the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there's definitely been a resurgence of handmade goods being, valued more than like what you can just go purchase off the shelf somewhere. Has that resurgence transferred over to your craft? Like, do you feel like there's more people interested in learning the craft and making them?
Yeah, people are calling this the new golden age of violin making within the industry. There was a bit of a lull in the sort of post-war to kind of late 90s, where there were people making and training and selling instruments, but it definitely wasn't anything like it had been before the war. And yeah, there was all of this kind of mass manufacturing was just getting started, importing from other countries, and so I think the industry suffered quite a lot at that point. But yeah, people are now starting again. It's becoming much more widely accepted for musicians in orchestras to play on new instruments, because there has been a bit of a stigma for a little while, where everybody wants to be playing a 400-year-old instrument. But all the investment bankers have kind of priced everybody out of those really nice instruments. So they're not as accessible, and so musicians turned back to luthiers and realized that there are lots of makers making excellent instruments that can easily as well be adapted to modern day concert halls, because you need them. You design them slightly differently depending on whether they're going to be played in a chamber orchestra and they need to blend in with everybody, or whether it's a soloist instrument that just needs like a massive amount of power to get to the back of the hall. And so actually there's a huge amount of benefit there for musicians to commission instruments directly. And while it's not cheap, it's definitely cheaper than buying a Strat. So yeah, it's kind of having a bit of a boom. And there are two main schools in the UK teaching violin making. The one I go to in London, we have maybe 15 students across the 3-year groups, and then the bigger one and the more well-known one is Newark, which is kind of north. And although they're going to tell me off for saying they're like the Midlands, but everything's north of London. Yeah. So, and they have, I think they produce about 30 in each year group. So like, but I'm not totally sure on that complete, but they're definitely bigger. And they get a lot of international students coming in because it's a degree course, whereas mine is not. It's just traditionally been like portfolio based. So the one in Newark they can sponsor international students. So
gotcha.
They get lots of people particularly from Germany and Italy and France. So that's like really cool. And yeah, there's good lot of violin makers being made at the moment. Yeah.
Do you feel like on the world stage that like Europe in general is still probably predominantly where violins are being handmade, or do you feel like it's kind of everywhere?
Yeah, I think it is everywhere. I think Europe, particularly Italian violin makers, carry a lot of cachet, like they can kind of say, oh, it was made in Cremona or Venice. And I think I've heard that particularly Asian markets really like to have Italian instruments. It's like a bit of a status thing. But I don't think for like the average musician that's the case. And certainly there are lots of really amazing American makers and South American makers, like all over the world. I think it has really spread globally as a craft, and also violin makers will communicate with each other way better now than they did 100 years ago in terms of sharing their knowledge. It's been quite a big push recently for everybody to stop kind of, before it was very like in the family kind of knowledge, and a huge amount of knowledge was just lost through that way of behaving. And it's quite timely now because obviously with COVID, it's sort of reminding everybody that we had a whole bunch of family dynasties of violin makers wiped out by the plagues in I don't know what year, a few hundred years ago. And you know, that we can't have that kind of thing happening again. And there's really no, if everybody shares information, actually the industry does better, and everybody creates better work. So it's not harmful to kind of to do
right that. It's community over competition, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely a lot of violin makers are much better about that now. So it's a really nice time to be training, because the older violin makers are all so generous with their time, in my experience. And yeah, so far I've been really enjoying the community that exists.
So is it similar, and I'm going to apologize if this analogy is really bad, but is it similar, like you have Spain and you have like Mexico, both countries speak Spanish, but they speak different dialects of Spanish, right? Different versions of it. Is it similar in the violin making community, where it's like a European, you know, some like yourself from the UK, you've been taught a certain way of making a violin, and somebody in South America is basically doing a different dialect of making
that's quite a good analogy. So there are tons of different ways to go about making a violin, and we call it a school. So you might say the German school, which doesn't refer to a specific school. It's just the German way of making it. And yeah, so the English way or British way is a bit of a mishmash of everything, as is our tradition. And then Germany has a really specific way of doing it, and Italy and different bits of Italy as well vary, and they have very specific ways of doing things. There's a German school in Mittenwald, which is really famous, and they like are extremely strict and have just like one way of doing everything, which for lots of people is great. But yeah, over here you sort of get taught a few different ways, and you just pick the one you like. And the results mean that there's quite a lot of variety, and I think that's nice. I think that if we were all making exactly the same instrument, then like it would be a bit boring, wouldn't it? So I think there's a violin out there for everyone, and it just means that you can like experiment and see which kind of violin you like. But yeah, there is definite styles of violin making,
but they're still all made of maple and spruce.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, when I talk to my dad about this stuff, he's just like, I mean, you say they're really different, but like when he's looking at them, and I'm trying to be like, but look at the F-holes, they're completely different. And it's like, but yeah, I mean, if you looked at 100 violins, you start to see it. It's like anything really. It's just repetition of like looking at it and pattern recognition. Yeah. So yeah, that was a good thing. That analogy works.
Okay, so one probably last question before the end here, and that is it typical? Are there a lot of women in the industry of making violins?
Historically, no. They were not. Well, it's a very complicated question. Historically, from a customer point of view, no. And in the history books, no. But my kind of informal mentor, a guy called Benjamin Hebert, is a really amazing historian and dealer in violins. And he's been uncovering evidence that actually women were making violins. They were just like doing it in their husband's workshop and not getting any credit.
Makes total sense. Total sense.
Yeah, and then also there was like a bit of a quirk in British law that meant that when a husband died, he could. The only way that women were allowed to own their own businesses was if they took over their past husband. Their business. And so there are a few cases that Ben has managed to dig out of women who have taken over their husband's violin shops. But even then, it would sort of be sold as like violins would still be sold with the label of the husband in it. So there's still a lot more research to be done about the historical side of it. And then nowadays, there are a lot more female violin makers. Definitely, like the schools, it's almost 50-50 being trained in. But then still like not great representation in terms of owning their own like big, like being the top. So you get lots of, particularly in repair work, a lot of women seem to go into repair work over making. And I wonder if that's to do with just like the irregularity of the income, because
I was gonna say
like gender barriers, and so like if a woman knows that she can go and get maternity leave at a repair, working in a repair shop, so but there hasn't really, that I'm aware of, been any studies in all of that, so that is just kind of anecdotal. I don't know, whether how accurate that is.
Right.
A reflection of the industry, but certainly what I've seen is that there are fewer, and certainly when you talk about like the great violin makers of modern times, like the majority of them will be listed as men, and that's not to say that there aren't great violin makers who are female, they're just not getting as much attention, but they are getting more attention than they used to, so it's going in the right direction, but there's definitely more work to be done. Like I won't name the name of this shop, but there was a violin shop who I noticed on their website had a list of who they deemed to be the 30 greatest modern makers, and they were all men. So I emailed them just being like, oh, hey, I noticed that the whole list is men. Is there any women you could maybe add or point me in the direction of, because I'm a student and it would be really great to have some female role models. And it was a female owner of this shop, but she just replied saying women just don't make as good violins.
Whoa.
I was like, oh my God. So yeah, I mean, and it's not true. There are some really amazing female makers. Like in the UK, we have a woman called Helen Mischerschlager, who makes particularly good violas. So yeah, I think it's just about like getting a bit more recognition for it, which is also why podcasts like yours are so amazing. Give back a bit more focus.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a bit blown away by that response.
Yeah, I mean, I was as well. I was just like, I don't even know what to go with
because
that. Like,
I mean, I look at especially a violin and knowing string instruments. I mean, out of all the string instruments out there, it is probably, to me, one of the most delicate instruments there are. And to me, delicate does not scream manly brawnliness.
Yeah, I know. It's weird, isn't it?
It's
like, I know. But that was a thing even like in some violin making schools when they first started letting women in, which I think was maybe in like the 70s. I think it wasn't that long ago.
That's just a sad statement that you
but they wouldn't let women make cellos in lots of schools because they said it was like women just couldn't make cellos. It was too big, too hard work. Couldn't do it. So yeah, they
do know women like made airplanes in World War II, right? Like they do.
Oh God, I know. Don't get me started. But the positive thing is that the industry is definitely like aware of the issues. So I'm quite heavily involved with the British Violin Making Association, and they're like very dedicated to making sure that like we start evening the scales in this. And then also there's like all the Black and ethnic minority, like I have never met or seen a Black violin maker at any of our events, so like that's a whole other area as well that we do need to massively improve on. So yeah, and I think the industry is definitely talking about it and starting to address that stuff. So I'm hopeful, but it doesn't mean that we can be like relaxed about it.
Did it ever make you stop and think, especially since you're going out on your own, to sign your violins as like E. Hardy versus Emma Hardy? I mean, did it ever stop and make you pause and say, will I be more receptive? Will I be received better if it's not known?
More, yeah, I mean, I never considered that specifically, just because violin, like when somebody's buying one of your instruments, they're going to meet you. So
True.
But I have definitely had I've gone home after events and said to my husband, like, I don't know how to present myself to musicians, because all of the examples are like men in suits, or like I don't know what a female violin maker wears when she sees clients, like it's just like things like that
Right.
like, just wear whatever you want. But yeah, just like that there are so few role models, and for like just knowing, like just stupid stuff like, do I dress smart? Do I wear dungarees like I'm wearing now? Or like, and then how a musician's going to respond, and like there is a lot of pomp in a lot of the way that some violin makers, not all, some violin makers sell their violins. They go for the like very suave kind of approach, and I don't know like how that translates. So yeah, like there's a whole like all of that, and I think I've just decided to just not worry about it, and just like you just gotta be yourself. And
you're just going to be the violin maker for the badass violin players, like violinists, like forget like the one elitist, like you're gonna be
well, I also like one of like my big gripes with the industry is how is like that elitism that, again, not all violin makers do, but traditionally classical music has got that problem. And so like what I want to be is like the friendly face that there's that families can come to, and parents, and kind of like more of the violin for the everyman.
Yes. Well, I mean to your point too, not just the industry of making the violins has very little representation of people of color or any kind of minorities. There's very few I could even think of who play classical music who are people of color,
right.
Besides dedicated programs that are aimed at communities of color.
Right. Yeah, and that again, I was just like reading recently, there was I might be able to send you the link to it afterwards, because I can't remember who put it together. I think it was possibly the Royal College of Music did a diversity study, trying to address those points, figure out what the issues were and how they could be tackled. So there are it is a problem in the industry that you cannot deny, and definitely needs work. But there are like some really encouraging stuff coming through. There's various orchestras that, I guess the problem is, when you just have it like, when it's just like a black orchestra or whatever, what you really ideally want is just like for there to be black musicians in an orchestra, and nobody is blinking an eye about it. And again, I think it's going in the right direction, but I think that there is still a huge amount of work to be done in that, and I hope to contribute to that in some way.
Awesome. Well, Emma, we are at the end of our time, so I want to give you a chance though to let people know how they can find you and see your amazing work.
So probably the easiest way is my Instagram account, which is Emma Hardy Violins, and then also my website is emmajhardy.co.uk. That's it really. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this. It's been great.
Thank you for saying yes. All right, again, that was Emma Hardy, and I'll include all the links to follow along with Emma. If you're listening, it will be in the show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, then it will be down in the description below, so you can make sure that you check out all of her social media and follow along with her as she works to continue to start building her business as a violin maker out on her own in London. All right, now if you enjoyed this episode and you're enjoying all the other episodes of the Maker Mom podcast with the Wonder Women segment, there's a few things that you can do. So first and foremost, if whatever device or app you are listening to or watching this on, make sure that you hit subscribe. Also, if you can head on over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review for the podcast, that helps it get discovered. So that is greatly appreciated, and all of that, of course, is free and pretty easy to do. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you leave comments down below and hit like or dislike if you didn't like it, either way, that again helps show that people are interacting with the video and helps this interview plus others get discovered. All right, but if you're really loving the podcast and you want to step it up a notch as far as supporting it, please check out Patreon. That's patreon.com/MakerMomPodcast. There are 4 tier levels. There's a $1, $3, and $5 tier level that come with different levels of merchandise. And then there is a $30 tier level, which will make you an official sponsor of the podcast. And so you will get your own little ad segment within the podcast. And that is pretty recent, pretty new. All right, so that is always welcomed. And I really feel like the crew over on Patreon is a tribe. And I continue to strive, don't always succeed, but continue to strive to grow it more and more as a community versus just supporting the podcast. So know that if you go over there, you will be considered part of the maker community for Maker Mom Podcast. All right, and then lastly, you can just plain outright get some merch. So if you head on over to my store under my Freeman Furnishing store, that is where I design and make furniture. That's freemanfurnishings.com/shop. Hit apparel, and there is the Maker Mom tee, and currently the version that is available there has the Mom Squad listed on the back, which is the first 65 moms that were interviewed for the podcast. So expect to see that change probably in November, December of 2020 this year to update to include more moms. All right. Thank you for listening or watching, whichever one you are doing. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. Hope you get to make something, and I will see you next week.